logged in on time. Question on the whiteboard. What is the weirdest food you've ever eaten? You're just sending out an email to those people who are late. Make sure I don't get anyone who's logged in. Okay, should be good there. Cole going to fried Oreos. It's a good one. It's been on the to try list. Like, you hear about it at state fairs all the time and just haven't gotten around to trying one. Ooh, Gabrielle with a dehydrated onion. Interesting. Oh, and then we do have a frog legs person. Excellent, excellent. That would be mine as well. I was at a Chinese buffet that had them, and I was like, okay, I'm never going to order frog legs at a restaurant, but if they're just here available at a buffet, I'll try it. It wasn't bad. It's kind of like dark meat chicken. That's what I would compare it to. All right. Send that email out and then get over to the vocab list so you can start jotting that down. Reminder here on the right while you're jotting that down. Again, just October 22nd, the last day to turn in any missing work from units 2 and 3. For some of you, that is basically meaningless. You're caught up on everything. You've turned everything in. You're good to go. There are some of you who have quite a few missing assignments currently in U.S. history. I would definitely recommend, start checking your grade book, seeing what assignments have a 0 listed, what you need to be working on getting caught up on, as you have, at this point, less than a month to get any missing work from units 2 and 3 turned in. But today we are going to kind of focus in on the growth of big businesses in the second half of the 1800s as part of this industrial revolution that the United States is going through. So we'll talk a little bit about the concept of capitalism, specifically what is known as laissez-faire capitalism. We'll also talk about the concept of monopoly, dig a little deeper into Andrew Carnegie and vertical integration. Then we'll get to John D. Rockefeller and talk about horizontal integration. And hopefully we get to the concepts of trust and JP Morgan. We'll see how things go. All right, take one last look at the vocab list if you need to. And then we'll begin here with a quick review question from yesterday, just to make sure we're kind of all on the right page. And yes, Cole, yeah, you're on the right track there. All right, so I'll bring up the polling tools here in just a moment. But which of the following would best describe the Industrial Revolution? Would it be A, the overthrow of state governments across the United States, B, the destruction of businesses in New York City, C, the rise of machines, factories, and new forms of energy, or D, the growing dependence on buying products from Europe? Which of those best describes the Industrial Revolution? Go ahead and use the polling tools to make your choice. And as always, if you're on a cell phone and the polling tools aren't working, you can send me your answer choice through the questions and answers chat. based on what we discussed on Tuesday, which of those would best describe the Industrial Revolution? And go ahead and if you're debating between a couple of answers, go ahead and make a selection. As always, there's no penalty for getting it wrong. Just kind of lets me know where people are at, what they're thinking. Also, just lets me know that you're actually here in class, that you didn't just log in and walk away from your computer. So let's see here. I'm still missing a response from Cole, Naya, Michaela, Jacob, and Steven. Which again, if you're on a cell phone or the polling tools aren't showing up for you because you just logged in, you can send me your choice as a private chat message. Oh, no worries, Cole. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, perfect. Good deal. And the majority of us went with C, and you would be correct. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, as the name implies, it is the process of industrializing, of America relying more on machinery for doing work, of the building of factories to house all of that machinery, and then because these machines are big, uh, they require immense amount of energy to run, and so bringing in new forms of energy, coal, kerosene, oil, electricity, eventually. And so then our student question for today, one of you asked, how did the Industrial Revolution change the world? And really, that's a question we're going to be answering throughout this entire unit. Uh, but since the question is asking about the world versus, the United States, one area that we otherwise normally wouldn't cover because it's more of a world history thing is that it further expanded international trade and connections. Now, civilizations have been trading with one another since the beginning of human history. That in of itself is not new. But as Britain is, for example, going through the Industrial Revolution, it's going to, one, want more raw materials to kind of feed its factories. That, for example, included buying cotton from the southern states. But then, with the rise of machines and factories, Britain was producing so much stuff, it was more than the British people ever needed. And so Britain is also going to increasingly be looking to sell its products to other parts of the world, which ultimately the United States will be following right along as we kind of get into the second half of the 1800s. America is starting to produce more than it needs. And so that's one of the things that starts to kind of change America's relationship with the rest of the world. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, America is rather limited in its connections with other parts of the world. It's not a big area of focus because it's focusing on internal growth. But as we get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, America is increasingly going to want to reach out and be interconnected with other parts of the world so that it can continue to grow its economy. And we'll kind of explore that in the next unit. So then let's get into laissez-faire capitalism. So capitalism first, just as a starting point. Capitalism is the concept that businesses should have a large amount of freedom in how they operate. That businesses are privately owned, so anyone can start and own their own business, and The business owner gets to decide, what kind of business are we going to do? Are we going to make pizzas? Are we going to make donuts? Are we going to sell shoes? Are we going to sell video games? Up to them. They get to decide what business they want to run. They then compete with other businesses under the idea that, whichever business is the most efficient or the most talented, it's ultimately going to be the most successful. When we specifically describe it as laissez-faire capitalism, that is kind of capitalism at its most extreme, because laissez-faire is French for let do, meaning government hands off. Let businesses do what they want to do. No touchy, let it be. Government shouldn't get involved in economics. Government shouldn't get involved in telling businesses what to do or how to do things. You should let businesses run however they want to run. So there's very little in terms of rules or regulations or laws that businesses have to follow. Other than laws that kind of apply to everyone, of like, no robbing, no murder, things like that. But the basic argument of laissez-faire capitalism is, if you give businesses the freedom to do things how they want and you get government out of the way, businesses will naturally try to become as efficient as possible, because they're growing and they're competing with other businesses. And that's ultimately going to help grow the economy the fastest. That's going to be great for customers because you have all these businesses that are competing with one another. And so they're going to try to create the best product at the cheapest price possible, because they want to attract business from other businesses. And so that's going to be good for customers too. That's the basic idea of laissez-faire capitalism. Government is hands off, no touchy. You let businesses kind of do things how they want to do things. And of course, why might that be good for companies? Why might a business owner like this idea of laissez-faire capitalism? Definitely. One, as Cole notes, it kind of gives business owners a lot of freedom. It allows them to do what they think is best for their business without having to worry, you know, is this allowed by the government? Um, and definitely, then to Gabrielle's point, gives business owners a lot of control. They get to decide how things are going to be done in their business. They get to decide how they treat their workers. They get to decide what products they produce and how they go about producing them. So businesses tend to like laissez-faire capitalism because it gives them a lot of freedom and flexibility to do things however they want. At the same time, what do you guys think about this? Might there be any problems with letting companies run their business however they want? Can you imagine any possible negatives of that? Definitely, Gabrielle. That could be one. Under laissez-faire capitalism, there is no concept of minimum wage. Businesses ultimately can decide to pay their employees whatever they want. And generally speaking, businesses are going to try to pay employees as little as possible, because the more you're paying your workers, the less profit for the business. Now, laissez faire capitalism as a philosophy is going to argue that, well, if one business is, underpaying their workers, those workers are going to just go to other companies that pay better, and that things will kind of work itself out over time. But if ultimately businesses kind of all agree to pay workers as little as possible, that may not end up necessarily happening. So, definitely, one potential negative impact of laissez faire capitalism is it doesn't necessarily end up being the best scenario for workers, for employees, because there's then also no requirement that companies have to provide benefits like time off or health insurance or things like that that we often associate with jobs today. So it may not necessarily be a great situation for workers. Um, what else here? Again, if businesses can basically operate however they want, uh, what kind of impact might that have on the environment? If under laissez-faire capitalism, businesses can basically operate however they want, that there are no regulations or rules, what might that end up meaning for the environment? Excellent, Cole. Under laissez-faire capitalism, there would be no rules or regulations regarding um, the disposal of waste products. That companies would basically be free to dump their waste wherever they want, whether that is polluting the air, or dumping waste material into river systems, water supplies, um, things like that, which is going to be a reality during the Industrial Revolution. So, laissez faire capitalism tends to also not be great for the environment. Because again, if companies are free to do whatever they want, companies are going to do whatever saves them the most money. And dumping your waste directly into the air or into the water versus properly disposing it, that's ultimately going to save companies money, and so that's what a lot of companies are going to decide to do. um, so there are pros and cons to laissez-faire capitalism. Ultimately, America in the late 1800s is arguably the closest the country ever gets to laissez-faire capitalism. The United States is still a capitalist country today in the sense that you have private businesses. People can, start their own business. Businesses, for the most part, are not, government businesses. They operate independently. But today in the United States, you have regulated capitalism where government has different rules and laws and regulations and requirements for businesses. A lot of that didn't exist in the late 1800s. Businesses in the late 1800s had a huge amount of flexibility compared to what they have today. There were very little rules and regulations. And on one hand, as we can see here looking at this chart, the economy of the United States did grow a lot during this time period of laissez-faire capitalism, of going from the aftermath of the Civil War into the early 1900s. So, on one hand, yes, we do see a lot of economic growth under laissez-faire capitalism. that does seem to check out. That if you remove a lot of rules and restrictions from businesses, business will grow, the economy will expand. At the same time, though, there do end up being some issues with this economic growth under laissez-faire capitalism. Some of the things we mentioned here we'll kind of explore in future class connects. Um, the big one that I want to get started with today, though, is looking at what potentially might be the issue if a business gets too big. Because as we mentioned, yes, on Tuesday, which is what this slide is from, the Industrial Revolution leads to the rise of new businesses, massive in size, big businesses that the country had really not seen exist before. With ultimately some of those businesses rising to the status of what we would call a monopoly. So, for those of you who have played the board game Monopoly, briefly, what is ultimately the goal of Monopoly? How do you win Monopoly, the board game? So yeah, the basic idea of Monopoly is that the players are buying up real estate, buying up land. And so you're trying to go around the board buying up as many properties as possible. And then once you own those properties, building houses and hotels to increase the price of them when other people land on it, charging them more and more money until the other players go out of business and there's just one person standing who essentially owns the entire game board at that point. And so what you are essentially doing is you are trying to create a monopoly where one person owns all of the property, owns all of the land on the board. Which, funny enough, the original design of Monopoly, the original creators of Monopoly, were actually people who were against capitalism and created the game as a learning exercise to illustrate to people how unfun and unfair this economic system could be. The great irony is that game then being bought up and turned into the most sold board game of all time. But I always find that interesting that Monopoly was originally designed to be a miserable gaming experience, and then it became the most popular board game of all time in the United States. I don't know what that says about us as a country, but it's interesting. But the basic idea of a monopoly in general, economically speaking, is when one business controls an entire industry, product, or service without competition. Meaning customers don't have any other options. They have to go through that one business because it's the only one exists. There is no competition. The competition has either been bought up or pushed out by the monopoly. And so one modern day example, arguably, is Ticketmaster. If you are trying to buy tickets to a concert, most likely you're going to have to go through the company called Ticketmaster for buying those tickets. They're basically the only company that exists for the processing of buying concert tickets. So they arguably have a monopoly. It doesn't matter, what website you go to, what band you want to see, you're inevitably going to have to do business with Ticketmaster, which a lot of people aren't a fan of because Ticketmaster tends to charge steep processing fees for providing you with your concert ticket, even though nowadays it's just sent to your phone and an email. And obviously that costs next to nothing to do that. So during the Industrial Revolution, we're going to see the rise of monopolies, companies that get bigger and bigger and bigger to the point that they kind of wipe out all of the competition. And so our first example is with Andrew Carnegie and US Steel, or also pronounced Carnegie, uh, as he was originally Scottish, but then when he comes to the United States, a lot of Americans pronounce it as Carnegie. But Carnegie will ultimately build the largest steel company in the United States, to the point that if you're buying steel in America, you're almost guaranteed you're buying it through US Steel, which steel, just in case you're not already familiar, is a stronger and more flexible form of iron. It's when you take the raw material of iron, and you heat it up and you combine it with some other elements to ultimately create steel, which is both stronger and more flexible than iron. And so, why might steel be an important product um, during the Industrial Revolution? Why might the country need a lot of steel at this time? Definitely. One, we have just a lot of construction. We have a lot of building during the Industrial Revolution. The building of buildings, facilities, including factories. So a lot of steel is going to be used in construction. And then definitely, we also have a lot of machines that are being built during this time period, and a lot of them are going to be built with steel. Uh, you also have, the expansion of the railroads, which use a lot of steel, both in the construction of railroad tracks and stations and the trains themselves. So steel was a good product to get into during the Industrial Revolution. The country couldn't get enough of it, it seemed like, as it was rapidly expanding economically. And so Carnegie is going to start with what is known as a steel mill, which is the facility that takes iron and the other raw materials, heats the iron up, and ultimately turns it into steel. But as Carnegie tries to grow his business and make his business more profitable, more successful, he's going to utilize a process known as vertical integration, which, again, just so we're all on the same page, what does it mean if we're looking at something vertically? What does it mean to be vertical? Yeah, it's something that is standing upward. If we're looking at something vertically, we're looking at something, top to bottom, up to down. So, like in math class, when you're talking about a vertical axis, that's one that's running vertically up and down. So Carnegie starts with steel mills. Um, but as he's building his business, he decides that it would be a good idea for his company, US Steel, to also own some iron mines. And so Carnegie starts buying up mines that are mining out iron. Um, which what might be the benefit of that for his company, of him owning the iron mines? It's a good thought, Gabrielle. Is One, that cuts off a supply of iron to his competitors. It's going to ensure that he has direct access to that iron. And if his company owns the mine versus having to buy the iron from a mining company, what do you think that does to the price he has to spend on iron? If the iron mine is already part of, right, it's less because he doesn't have to worry about buying it from another company that's obviously looking to make a profit. He's basically getting it at cost because it's from his own iron mines. Um, so if he no longer has to pay extra money for iron, what would that ultimately do to the price he would have to charge for his steel? If he no longer has to pay as much money for the iron, what might that allow him to do to the price of his steel that he makes out of that iron? Right, decrease it because he has lowered his business cost. He doesn't have to pay as much for iron. And then he's also going to start buying up coke fields, which is basically another form of coal. It's what's used to heat up the iron. Um, he's then also going to start buying up ships and railroads. So he doesn't have to pay other companies to transport his product. And so he's decreasing his cost of doing businesses. Um, he's creating a business where it's all self-contained. He doesn't have to hire or pay any outside companies. He does it all within his own business. And so by doing so, that decreases his costs of making steel, which then ultimately means he can lower the price of his steel. Uh, which at first we hear that and go, well, why would you want to lower the price of your product? Wouldn't you make more money if you just kept the price where it was at? So, what would be the benefit of lowering the price of US steel? Because that is exactly what he does. But why do it? Why not just leave the price at where it was? So, excellent. Yeah. One, if you're lowering the price of US steel, you're making, that steel more affordable, potentially bringing in more customers. You might have had business projects that originally weren't thinking about buying steel because they're like, oh, steel's too expensive. We'll go with a cheaper option. But oh, well, now US steel is at this price. Yeah, let's do that. Um, definitely, ultimately leading to the building of more factories and machines. In addition to that, then even with a bigger construction project that does have a lot of money and is planning on buying steel, as they're shopping around looking at the different steel companies, why are they probably going to go with US Steel at this point? Yeah, because they're not as expensive. And a basic rule of economics is, generally speaking, if products are kind of viewed as being identical, people choose the cheaper option. And during this time period, it was US Steel because Carnegie had used vertical integration. He basically bought up all of the steps in the steel making process so that he could offer his steel at a cheaper price, which meant more and more people bought US steel. Um, which basically kicked other steel companies out of business. They weren't able to lower their price to match US Steel. They didn't get as many customers. They went out of business, um, or were bought up by Carnegie. And so you eventually get to the point where if you wanted to buy steel in America, you basically had to buy it through Carnegie and US Steel. It was a monopoly. There basically wasn't any other significant competitor. So that's one way a monopoly can kind of be built, is through this concept of vertical integration. Let's look at another here with John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. So even prior to the Civil War, oil, which is a natural resource that is extracted out of the earth as a black liquid, um, can ultimately be processed in various different ways to create different fuel supplies. One of the things that you can take oil and turn it into is kerosene, which back in the mid 1800s was valuable for lighting. You had what are known as kerosene lamps, where at the bottom of the lamp here, you'd kind of have this pool of kerosene, and then that would be burned off over time, providing you with a source of indoor nighttime lighting, which is increasingly becoming valuable as people are wanting to spend more time working and doing things at night. And so oil started to become a highly demanded material. And so Rockefeller, along with a couple of business partners, starts up what's called a refinery business. A refinery is the facility for processing and heating up oil to turn it into different usable products. Ultimately, it can be turned into a number of different things. Kerosene, gasoline is, one of the main reasons, why we still depend on oil today. Things like that. What Rockefeller, though, is going to do to kind of build his monopoly with Standard Oil is what's called horizontal integration. And so, again, just so we're all on the same page, what does it mean if something is horizontal, or we're looking at something horizontally? Perfect. Yes. Horizontal means we're looking at something left to right, or something that is lying down. If someone says, I just need to be horizontal for a minute, it's a way of saying I need to go lie down on a couch or a bed. Instead of being vertical, I need to be horizontal. So if we imagine, the oil business as being a couple of different steps, you first have to drill the oil out of the earth. Then you have to transport that oil to, facilities, which would include the refinery, where the oil is heated up and again turned into usable products like kerosene and gasoline. And then finally, you got your sales and distribution of the final product. Yeah, so a simplification, but we have oil, defined here as being 4 steps as a business. So what Rockefeller did to grow his business is he started buying up additional oil refineries, until eventually he kind of controls practically all of the refineries in an area. So he has horizontal integration. He has basic control of this entire step in the oil making process. And so thinking about how this helps his business, um, let's think of Company A as a drilling company. Company A has drilled oil out of the ground. And when it comes time for Company A to, hire a company for transportation, it has a couple of different options. But once Company A decides, gets to the refinery process, which company is it going to have to use for the refining step, according to the chart here? Company A could go with, Company E for transportation, Company F for transportation, Company G for transportation, Company H for transportation. But once it comes time to refine that oil, what's their option? They could do all of them. Um, but who owns all of the refineries at this point, according to the chart? Yes, there are a number of different refineries you could send that oil to, but who owns them all? If we start here, who owns this first refinery, according to the chart? Standard Oil. Okay, well, maybe we don't want to work with Standard Oil and that refinery. So let's go to the second refinery. Who owns that refinery, according to the chart? Standard Oil. Oh, okay. Well, shoot. We really didn't want to do business with Standard Oil. So I guess maybe we'll try the third refinery. Um, Again, Standard Oil, because exactly as Cole says, they've monopolized all the oil refineries. You didn't have a choice. If you wanted that oil processed into kerosene, you had to go through Standard Oil. That is what's known as horizontal integration, taking control of an entire step in the business process so that they all have to come through you one way or another, which ultimately meant that Rockefeller and Standard Oil was always involved in the profits. Basically any oil that was being extracted would have to come through Standard Oil because they bought up all the refineries. You didn't have a choice at that point, which of course is then going to make Standard Oil a lot of money. And as Standard Oil grows, they're then going to be able to start buying up their own transportation systems. They'll start buying up or making deals with train companies. They'll start buying up oil lands for themselves, increasingly buying up more and more of the chart until you eventually got to the point that Standard Oil controlled almost all of the oil industry in the United States. And so, why is this important? Well, on one hand, having a monopoly, ultimately means you've created a very successful business. Your business has become the largest. It has muscled out the competitors, and generally speaking, in order to do that, your business has to be efficient. It has to have some sort of advantage over the competitors to be able to knock them all out of business. Um, Monopolies, because of their size, oftentimes are able to accomplish more than smaller businesses. They have more resources, they have more money to spend. Um, Again, you think about a modern day example, look at something like Amazon. Because so many people do online shopping through Amazon, um, Amazon is able to provide benefits that smaller companies can't provide. Things like free shipping, um, additional services like, Amazon Prime with, streaming and music and, ebooks and all of that. But at the same time, looking at the cartoon here on the whiteboard, what seems to be the message of the cartoon regarding Standard Oil? What is it? How is Standard Oil as a company kind of depicted here in this cartoon? I like it as a kraken sucking everything in, or like, as an octopus with, these tentacles of the oil pipeline, coming out and taking everything over, buying up, all of the drilling lands, all of the refineries, buying up railroads, banks, factories, ships. You might even notice that one tentacle is kind of making its way to what seems to be a representation of Washington, D.C., perhaps, threatening to ultimately have control over government itself. Um, because ultimately, once a company has a monopoly, once it has total control over an industry, it can then start raising its price. And why are people ultimately going to have to pay that higher price if it's a monopoly? Because you got no other options. They've knocked out all of the competition. There's no one you could go to that's giving you a lower price because the monopoly is your only option. Again, we could go back to a company like Ticketmaster today. A lot of people don't like Ticketmaster. They don't like paying the processing fees. That sometimes can be, just as much as the concert ticket, it seems like. But you got no other options. You got no other business or website you can go through, generally speaking. And so even though those processing fees seem outrageous, people pay them because it's essentially a monopoly. You got no other choice. And so some states first tried to start passing some state laws, um, to try to push back against the growing power of monopolies. But ultimately, these companies are going to be very successful at finding workarounds, because they're so big and make so much money, they can afford a bunch of, expensive lawyers and accountants to try to figure out ways around these regulations. So one of the things Rockefeller does is he creates what's called a trust, where technically speaking, all these businesses he's buying up remain separate businesses, but they are ultimately all overseen by what's called a trust, a group of directors that oversees the running of everything and ultimately then can coordinate with one another, to continue to provide an advantage to Standard Oil, even though the companies are technically independent entities, but they're all overseen by the same trust. Finally, real quickly, J.P. Morgan as another titan of industry during this time period. Morgan was a banker, but specifically, he's an investment banker, meaning he's not really interested in providing people like savings accounts or loans for a house like you think about with like a traditional bank. No, he's more into buying up stocks and bonds from companies that he thinks will do well and make him and his investors a profit. And so, as the cartoon indicates, over time, Morgan got involved in a lot of different industries: oil, mining, railroads, all kinds of things. Um, and so, on one hand, Morgan helped provide the money to let businesses grow. If Morgan looked at a company and he said, "Ooh, I think this company might be really successful," Morgan would invest in it, providing that company with the money to grow. Um, but he also became one of the dominant powers of the economy. Morgan and his bank ended up having so much influence on the economy that he could basically crash or save the economy at his whim. At one point, for example, the country's going through an economic crisis, and the president goes to JP Morgan for help of like, hey, what can you do to fix it? Which, that's kind of a crazy situation to think about today of, the president going to, a single banker and saying, "Hey, our country's in trouble. You need to fix it. You're the one who actually has the power to fix it." And so that's one of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution is we start seeing some of these business leaders generating so much wealth or having so much wealth that they literally had more power than the government of the United States. But I see we're unfortunately out of time, so we'll have to stop there. As always, if you have questions, stick around. Happy to answer them. Otherwise, you're good to go. Have a great day. Hope you enjoy the upcoming weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday. See you, Gabrielle. You're welcome, Trey. See ya.